Brace yourself for another interest rate hike at the end of the month. That will be due to rising inflation, driven in part by rising food and fuel costs. Wandile Sihlobo from the Agricultural Business Chamber believes there's a better way to address the problem. He suggests that targeted support to poor households and small farmers could mitigate the impact of these increases. Questions are also being asked about the country exporting food in the midst of the crisis. Let's discuss all of this now with Wandile. Wandile, good afternoon and thank you very much for your time. Welcome to Today on ENCA. I've read your opinion piece, or a summary of it at least. I know when you do write, you really go into details, so I haven't gone through all the nitty-gritty. But I find it interesting that you are saying basically that long before the war in Russia and Ukraine, food prices, certain products were already increasing. Just share your thoughts around that with our viewers.
Absolutely, Braden. Food prices have been on the rise globally and even here at home. And I think, Braden, the best way to look into this is to check 2018, where food price inflation was in South Africa. We're hovering around 3% on average for that year. You go to 2019, you see food price inflation rising to close around about 4.8%. 2020, we see the numbers creeping up over time to up until last year, of course, where food price inflation in the country had averaged around about 6.5%. But this has been something that has been happening not only here at home, but globally. And globally, there are distinct factors that are behind the rise in food prices. Firstly, we had droughts in South America, Brazil and Argentina, which are major producers of grains and oilseeds. And when anything happens in the supply in those two countries, you see everybody catching the cold because of the cough in those two countries. And secondly, you had China, which was rebuilding its pig industry and buying a lot of grain. And that demand coming out of China was one of the factors that was also pushing up global prices. And lastly, Braden, you had also within the US, a very intensive use or expansion on the biofuel industry, where some of the grains were going into that space. So the combination of those things is what has been pushing food prices overall across the world on an upside trajectory over the past 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and the little known Indonesia, we also had weather challenges. I find that fascinating, the importance. Well, agriculture, of course, we know relies a lot on weather, but we don't realize in the world who contributes what to global food products, like palm oil. You take it for granted that it's something simple to grow, but Indonesia was badly affected. Now, those are the key global factors that you've mentioned. Then comes the war, Russia and Ukraine. That exacerbated matters.
Absolutely, that exacerbated the measures, Braden. And the little Indonesia that you're speaking about, I mean, roughly over 50% of the palm oil exports are coming out of that country. And you know that when you have a problem in palm oil, you see its effects across all of the cooking oils. Either you are thinking about canola or you are thinking about sunflower oil. All of those shots do come out of that. And the war, as it comes at the end of February, it really exacerbates that environment, because what you were stuck with now is an environment where global grain stocks were already somewhat under pressure, and then having Ukraine and Russia being some of the major exporters of grains, and on the oilseed side are unable to actually push out the volumes as they would typically do without the war. And that complicated the picture. And I think this is what now the world is beginning to deal with. And even with those dynamics, Braden, I still think that as South Africa, we are in a relatively better place if you compare us with many countries in Africa and indeed in the developed world.
Wandile, but if we were in a better position, why are we paying so much for food? We are producing so much. And in your piece here, you say, and I'm quoting for the benefit of our viewers, we've had 3 consecutive seasons of favorable rains and large agricultural produce. Why are we paying so much when we have such wonderful production seasons?
The simple way, Bradan, perhaps maybe to look into this for the viewers, I would make a point that if you were to look at the food price inflation, which is the rate at which food prices are rising in a country. In South Africa, for example, the latest number we have for May is food price inflation at around about 6.8% or so, around about that range. But if you were to compare that with what's going on across the world, you find that many countries, in fact, are over 10%. So we are still seeing our prices rising at a moderate pace. Why are we seeing our prices rising while we have all of these large crops that we're seeing? Is the fact that no country is an island. I mean, the prices that we do pay and our interconnectedness to the global market, it does mean that whenever there are shocks in the major producing countries and the issues of wars, that does gets reflected on the prices in South Africa. But the fortunate place is the fact that as South Africa, we are not at a space where we are worried about running out of food, as it's the case in the other countries. We are safe on the supplies, but the inescapable thing for anyone across the world is the pricing because of that interconnectedness of the world that we live in.
So what I hear you saying is that South Africa's agricultural sector is interlinked with the global agriculture market. We can't really extricate ourselves from that. Finally, what about exports then? Although you say we're not in a position where we're about to run away food, should we therefore still continue to export the agricultural produce?
Absolutely, Bradan. We're not going to run out of food. And to the point that I was making earlier, to say our food price inflation, 7.8% in May. In fact, not 6.8% as I've just mentioned now. But in as far as the export side, we are a country that is generally a net exporter of food. We export about half of what we produce in value terms, but we cannot get into a position where we can say we've sold all of our food. Now fellow South Africans don't have their food. There are mechanisms that are in place where we are tracking week by week what goes out, and prices readjust when we reach the certain levels where we think now the exports should slow. There are mechanisms to manage that.
Okay, my final question to you, Wandile. You suggest that there should be a targeted support to poor households and support of subsistence and small-scale farming in order to improve household food production. How critical is that at this stage in our country?
I'll make quick points there, Braden. Two quick points. The first point is that we shouldn't be thinking about either limiting export or intervening on any price intervention. The better way of dealing with the current situation is to say, how can the Department of Agriculture, Social Development, and the others actually assist the households in as far as supporting the household food production? It might be through seeds or various instruments that they already do have, but how can they make those quite agile? There are discussions that can take place in as far as that particular point is concerned. And lastly, the prices that we are increasing, or food price inflation, the increases that we are seeing, we're likely for the next 2 months to see further increases in June and July. But second half of the year, we see food price inflation softening in South Africa, particularly on fruits, vegetable, and to an extent meat, while grains and oilseeds could remain somewhat slightly elevated. Overall, Braden, the point is the increases that we're seeing are temporary in the country, and there's a lot that can be done on supporting the households, and that's where the focus should be in rather than any other intervention.